donations for the Bracken Library's Judaica collection and support for programs, lectures, and cultural events like today. We also are, I am very pleased to share this podium with Joan Todd, who is the Associate Vice President at Ball State for Strategic Communications and Ball State's Chief Communications Officer, kind of the face of us all. And she's going to make the introductions of our speakers. Okay?
Thank you.
Hold on.
Okay. I'll talk fast. And I'm loud anyway, so I'm not even sure that I need the microphone. But thank you so much for being here. My father, Marty Schwartz, who just last Sunday celebrated his 99th birthday surrounded by family, was a lieutenant commander in the Navy during World War II. As a child, I had asked him why he felt so strongly about serving his country, and he told me that Hitler was threatening him and his family and the way of life we enjoyed in this country. And he was going to do everything he could in his power to stop him. You see, his father came from Lithuania. My mother's family came from Hungary. And my father's father worked very hard to pay to bring all of his 7 brothers over, one by one, to escape persecution in Eastern Europe. While Dad remembers significant anti-Semitism growing up, he knew from his father's stories that he had opportunities here that would be impossible in Europe. My father was one of a handful of Midwesterners admitted to Harvard in 1934, part of Harvard's very early efforts to diversify. And with a Jewish boy from Muncie, they did exactly that. He was told at Harvard by well-meaning upperclassmen that he wouldn't be allowed to do this or that because he was a Jew. But by the time he graduated in 1938, he had done all of those things. He met and married my mother and started a family, but as the stories from Japan and Germany began to dominate the news, and he heard of Hitler's rise to power, he worried what would become of the world if Hitler took hold. He said it was never lost on him that he left his family voluntarily to save them and his country, and he knew he was privileged to have that opportunity when fellow Jews in Europe did not. Years later, my husband told me that his father led the American group of special forces who liberated Auschwitz. While they had heard the horror stories, they were in no way prepared for what they saw. My husband, who followed his father in his father's footsteps into the FBI, told me his father only discussed it with him one time, and he wept, recounting what they found. One time my husband asked him for more details about his experience there, but his father refused to speak about it ever again. Today we remember because we make a point to tell these stories, not one time, but over and over. Those who were there, such as our honored guest and speaker, Mr. Alex Starr, who, with his family members, were forced into labor camps. He managed to escape the Germans, nearly freezing and starving to death, only to be recaptured and escape again several times. Mr. Starr made it back to his hometown in Hungary in 1945, only to learn that most of his family did not survive the Holocaust. We remember because second-generation survivors tell these stories, such as Mr. Starr's nephew and our honored guest, Mr. Tibor Klopfer. Did I say that right? He tells of his father's imprisonment in labor camps and how he lost his first wife and 2 young daughters in the camps. And he tells of his mother's forced winter march from one labor camp to another before the British liberated her and other survivors at the end of the war. Why recount these horrors? What is the point? It is so we don't fall victim to revisionist history, so we don't become complacent, so it can never happen again. Without further ado, I give you Alex Starr and Tibor Klopfer.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan and Francine. My apologies for being late again. Just got tied up a little bit in traffic and didn't think it would take quite so long. I'm going to try going without the microphone. I've got a pretty loud voice. I have to use the microphone? Okay, I'll use the microphone. I can do as I'm told. My only disappointment this afternoon is that when we were late and with the David Letterman heritage at the school here, I expected a stand-up comedian to be, keeping you entertained and to warm up the audience for me. So,
I'm so sorry. I left my material at home.
well, next time we'll see if we can do better. Alex, you may want to move up. We might want to move the chair up a little bit here, get you a little closer to everybody, and so you can see the screen as well. And then I will go ahead and begin. Now, I'm sure that most of you already know a lot about the Holocaust and about World War II history and about the context in which the Holocaust occurred. How many of you have actually studied the Holocaust in school? Anyone? Yeah, a lot of you. Good. And how many of you, we heard from Joan already, but how many of you have or know of family members who fled the Holocaust? Right? A few of you, or who perished in it or survived in Europe. Well, okay. So I think you know already that the Nazi philosophy held that Germans are racially superior and that Jews and others are inferior races that constituted a threat to the so-called pure German racial community. With this justification, the Nazis and their collaborators carried out the Holocaust, which is the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews. Now, the Nazis also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority. Is that something that you learned about or otherwise know about? Some of you do? Yeah, good. So they also persecuted the Roma, or Gypsies as they're commonly called, the physically and mentally disabled, and some of the Slavic peoples, in particular Poles, Russians, and others. And yet other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, among them communists, socialists, Roman Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as gays. Now, I think that the Nazi atrocities in the Holocaust are so enormous and overwhelming, and I might even say so familiar to us today, that it's all too easy to lose perspective. And to keep that from happening, Alex and I will focus today on what might seem to be just a tiny part of the Holocaust. And that small part is what happened with Hungarian Jews in the last year or so of the war and the last year or so of the Holocaust. And so what that is really is one group of people in one country out of more than 60 countries that were involved in World War II, and 12 months out of over 12 years of the Holocaust. And Alex and I will tell you that story of Hungarian Jews from a very personal perspective, that is, from the story of our own family. And before I go on, let me mention there's a small computer here that hopefully some of you can see. You'll see some faces up on the screen. I'll talk some more about that in a few minutes, but every once in a while, take a look at that. Take a look at those faces. Alex himself, as Joan explained, is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was born in Hungary in 1926, and he was a teenager there during the Holocaust. Now, most of you, at least the students, were teenagers in high school just a few years ago, right? I think I heard a right back on that one. Alex was about 14 at the beginning of the war, and he was 18 when he was forced to join a slave labor battalion. That's the age of perhaps the youngest of you here in the room today. Anybody here 18 years old? Anybody willing to admit that? Good, thank you. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind Alex's age when he describes his experiences, and indeed compare that to your own life experiences when you were his age. I'm, of course, too young myself to be a survivor of the Holocaust, but as Joan mentioned, both my parents were survivors. Each of them was liberated by Allied troops from German concentration or death camps at the end of the war, my mother from Bergen-Belsen and my father from Dachau. Alex will share with you some of his firsthand experiences in the Holocaust, and we'll both tell you more about our family members who survived and about the many who died in concentration camps, in slave labor camps, or were just shot or killed on the streets or in the fields of Hungary. Much of the story takes place here, or at least it begins in the northwestern part of Hungary. Now, Hungary is a small, landlocked country right in the middle of Europe. It happens to be about the size of Indiana, just sort of turned on its side. And by the way, this 1933 map that you see up on the screen shows Hungary's borders as they were established after World War I, with the country's borders shrunken by treaty as a result of being on the losing side of the war. I have another map here that shows Hungary's location in Europe. You can see that this 1944 map shows expanded boundaries for Hungary, with some of the pre-World War I territories having been restored to it by Germany, frankly, as a reward for being allied with Nazi Germany in World War II. At the beginning of World War II, there were around 800,000 Jews in Hungary out of a total population of around 9 million people. Most of our family members were among those 800,000 Jews living in the northwestern part of the country that I highlighted before. How many of you are from large families? Anybody? You get together, do you know your aunts and uncles and your cousins? You have family reunions? I can see that you do. You know them well. Before the war, our family in Hungary was a very large extended family as well. Here's a photo from a family wedding in the earlier mid-1930s. My mother, Muncie, is in the back row, fourth from the left. She was about 20 or 22 years old then. She and my father weren't married yet, and in fact, they didn't even know one another. Alex is not in this particular photo because he was too young to attend the wedding. His mother stayed home with him. Here are some more family photos from before the war. As I said, we had a large, active and interactive family, and I'll ask Alex to explain some of these photos. Alex, do you want to talk about them? That one first?
Number one is my grandfather, called him Lawrence Singer, and he lived in a small village, and the next picture was my grandfather and my grandmother and one of my youngest aunts. And my next picture is this group. My grandfather and my grandmother and my mother sitting on this side, and the rest of them, my grandfather and grandmother and 9 children. And I wasn't in that picture, but in the next picture on my mother and my 2 aunts, and the center one was my youngest aunt that had the 2 little children. She was married to Joseph Deutsch. And they had 2 little children. Name was Vera and Sophie. And the name was Kunstgart, next to German. A small village, the only Jewish family was there. And her husband eventually ended up in Auschwitz, and she went to Auschwitz, and my mother and children went to Auschwitz and go through gas chambers. I never did know what happened after war, what happened to my mother, my children. And I was, in this picture here, a group of very strong Zionist group that operated underground in Hungary. My brother was down there, Louis Chillog, and he was a member of the group. I couldn't be a member because I was too young. And this group was going to go to Palestine, but the Hungarian drafted him. And actually, my father passed away before Hitler came in 1939. He was in the Austro-Hungarian army.
Alex, we have some more photos here too, and I'm going to ask Alex to tell you about them. This is Alex and my mother here on the right side from your side, and here are two. No, you're on the right one. Here are two photos, also family photos from 1939 that I'll ask Alex to describe to you.
That first picture, it's my grandfather's home, and I'm standing there in the snow, and we're celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And my mother standing there next to me with my little sister, 4 years old. And next to it, my grandfather and grandmother, her brother, and there's my brother, Louis, standing on the end. And eventually, first he was in the Hungarian army, and then he stripped the uniform off and put him in the working camp, and eventually the Hungarian turned him over to the Germans, and he ended up picking mine in front of the German army, and he blew up, and he died in 1942. And actually, after my father passed away, he brought me up in the big city, and with the city I was only had 6th grade, and the Jews can't get education, college, or anything anymore. So I had 2 extra grades. Then I ended up, when I was 14 years old, I signed up for electrical trade electrician, and they let me go to trade school for 3 half days a week, and I had to work till 18. And when I got 18 years old, I just got my journeyman electrician card, and my mother and my little sister lived about 100 miles away from me, and I had to go home and help them go in the ghetto in Chora.
We'll get to that in a minute. Well, these let me go ahead and pick up and continue for a minute to move things along. The photo on the right is Alex's immediate family, except for his oldest brother, Joe, who actually took the picture, so he's not in it. Alex is circled. You can see him there. To his right is his little sister, Petey, then his mother and his father. My mother is in the back row, and two of Alex's brothers are there. My father's family was pretty large too. He had three sisters, Rose, Gizush, and Magda. His favorite sister was Magda, who's circled there in yellow. My father also had an older brother, Arpad, that he admired and looked up to. My father married just before the war on August 15, 1939, although not to my mother. This is his wedding photo, my father with his first wife. They had two daughters, my half-sisters, over the next few years before my father was sent to a slave labor camp. I don't have photos of my half-sisters, and in fact, I don't even know their names. Now, we've looked at several 1939 photos, and very shortly after these 1939 photos were taken, World War II officially began, as you probably know, with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. At the beginning of the war, the nation of Hungary, like Italy, had a fascist government and was allied with Nazi Germany. In the early years of the war, as I mentioned, Nazi Germany rewarded Hungary, first by giving it back some territories that it had lost at the end of World War I, and also by allowing Hungary mostly to govern its own internal affairs. That will become important in our story a little bit later. What we'd like to do next is to have Alex tell you about his life and his family's life in the early years of the war, that is through 1943. I think they want you to use this, Alex. So, Alex, if you could talk about the early years of the war before the Tornado.
Well, and actually, Hungary was the last country who had to first of all made the ghettos and everything was the last country in it started in 1944 early, and the 1944 they start marking its with the star, and
Let me help a little bit because I think that's moving ahead on the story, if it's okay. As I think you've heard Alex describe, because he was a Jew, he wasn't allowed to continue in school, and instead he was apprenticed as an electrician in the nearby city of Győr. And as a young teenager, he continued to work as an electrician's apprentice in Győr, originally living with his older brother, Louis, who was right in the middle there in uniform and not in uniform next to that. His older brother, Joe, who's pictured here, was already in the Hungarian army at the beginning of the war. But when the war began, since 1938, and do you want to explain what happened when the war began to Joe?
This 1938, he was in the regular army, and they stripped the uniform, and right away he transferred him in the working unit, and then eventually he ended up in the Russian front, and he got injured during the war, and ended up the Russians take him as a prisoner and put him to Siberia. He worked there but a year after the war was over and the Russian didn't do anything to his injuries and send him back to Hungary. And that's only time that was about a year after that. We didn't know he was alive. And when he got to Budapest, that's where we found out he's still alive. And he got married soon after that, and in 1947.
Okay, well, we're giving a little bit too much away there about the future, so we're going to turn back the clock to the early years of the war and continue talking about that for a few minutes. While the Hungarian government severely repressed the country's Jews, it was not quite as brutal as the Nazis in Germany or in the captured territories like Poland. Still, the Hungarian government continued to adopt laws that made life difficult for Jews. There were restrictions on occupations and ownership of property. It was very difficult to make a living. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the Hungarian racial laws a bit later. The day-to-day lives of those remaining in their homes was miserable, with shortages of food, clothes, and other essentials. Worse, as Alex has illustrated with his brothers, my uncles, the government began forcing able-bodied Jewish men into labor battalions that were essentially slave labor initially for the Hungarian army. For those remaining in their homes, like my mother, my grandmother, and my young aunt Piri, there were worries about their missing brothers, sons, and husbands, and growing fears about what might come next. Things, in fact, did change drastically, and for the worse, in early 1944. The Hungarian government realized that Nazi Germany was losing the war, and the government wanted to declare Hungary neutral and make peace with the United States and the other allies. When Nazi Germany found out about these secret negotiations, they immediately occupied Hungary and installed a puppet government. Official German occupation of Hungary began in March of 1944. And as an omen of more to come, one thing they did was require all Jews to wear yellow stars and armbands. Almost immediately, the most brutal Nazi policies began to be imposed on Hungarian Jews. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that we're already nearly at the end of the war. And you're right. Victory in Europe Day was May 8, 1945. But unfortunately, this 14 or 12-month period was plenty of time for the Nazis to carry out their atrocities. One of the first steps taken by the Nazis was to begin concentrating the Hungarian Jews in rural and urban ghetto areas. Alex, still working in Yud, circled on the map there, still working in Yud, saw a posted schedule by the authorities calling for rural Jews to be moved from their homes to designated rural ghetto areas. So, Alex, if you could, I'd like you to talk about what happened when you saw that list in Yud and went to help your family. Here's the microphone.
My mother and my little sister was about 6 years old, and the village name was Sill, and I had to go home, help him, packed up personal thing, and help him go in. My mother was 48, and my little sister was 6, and ghetto. We went in June 14 and 15, and my mother and my little sister and I, including I, stayed with them in the ghetto. And eventually...
Alex left out that he actually got there by riding a bicycle. He found
Yeah.
a bicycle and rode from Yud to Seal, which was how far, Alex?
about 120 miles, and I used to ride the weekend home, and I went also. I ended up already wore a star, and just happened I was outside the door, and but 1,000 aeroplane top of me, American, already came from Italy, and one of the aeroplane exploded and knocked all people down, and the Germans and the Hungarian Nazis went out and tried to capture. The Germans captured them and put them in the camp, but the Hungarian Nazis, they killed them right out there. And I had to bend down and the star on. I had to take my oath. If I find me out there, they get me too. So I survived, and I went home, and I was in the ghetto only about a couple of weeks, and
Well, let's talk some more about how you helped your mother and your sister move to the Chorna ghetto.
well, the packed up personal thing, and horse and buggy, and took the village. Seal only had about 20 family Jews, the rest of them Catholic. I went to Catholic school in the 6th grade. That's the only thing they had. And they got to the ghetto, and after that, took the young ones out, and up to 40, the men, take them out on the big farmland, and we work on the farmland. And the time I returned to the ghetto, by that time, packed my mother and sister up, went to Schopron, and that's a center right by the border of Germany. And
Okay. So Alex helped his mother and his sister move to the Chorna ghetto, which was another rural ghetto area in Hungary. The Nazis were concentrating the Jews together. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute as well. Now, this ghetto was guarded by Hungarian Nazis and by German SS troops, and Alex was allowed to stay there with his family in the Chorna ghetto for just about a week until he himself was taken away to a labor battalion. He had turned 18 just a few months earlier, so he was ready to be drafted into these slave labor battalions.
18 to 42.
Right, the men. Now here's a photo of Alex's mother and sister, my Aunt Petey, my grandmother. I think this photo was taken in Seal shortly before the family was forced to move, and it's the last photo we have of Petey and Aronka, Alex's mother. I'm going to come back to their story and to that of my mother in a few minutes. But first, Alex, what I'd like to do is ask you to tell us about some experiences during this time, that is starting in late June. Let's go to the next page there. Starting in late June of 1944, after he was taken from his family in the Chorna ghetto. You want me to start and have you chime in? Okay, yeah. Well, he and the other able-bodied male Jews in the Chorna ghetto, which we've highlighted there, were taken to a nearby farm owned by the Esterházy family. That's a prominent Austro-Hungarian family of royalty. They made them work the farm until, well, why don't you talk about that, Alex?
Well, they started working on there, and eventually shipped us out on the different farm, a whole summer I was supposed to join 150 trainmen. We never get to the factory, but we get to other farm right by the border, Hungary and Austria. And all the summer we harvest weeds, and I run tractors, and I was over there. We didn't have any guards, just foremen over there who run the place, and we were all right till September. When we finished up, they start moving us. When we finished there, went to eastern part of Hungary, and it would start raining and started getting cold. And when we get there, the Russian army is supposed to already was on the border, the Carpathian Mountains, and it was threatening us to take over. And the Germans, and by that time, left Romania, and everybody was going back. And I ended up in Budapest doing nothing. We almost a month. We just sitting there because lucky the colonel who was charged of us, a Hungarian, he tried to keep us there and do something, but eventually he can succeeded, and he moved him off with.
Take that back for a minute. So Alex, just to recap, has explained how he worked in various farms in the northwestern part of Hungary. They were moved by train to Diós Győr, that's the top oval up there, and gave up trying to farm there because it was too damp. And then meanwhile, the Russian troops were invading. They had reached Debrecen, which is one of the larger cities in Hungary, and so the guards decided to retreat. And they ended up back in Budapest at the Kelty train station there. Alex's group of about I think there were about 150 of you at that point, were guarded by one older Hungarian army officer who seemed to be trying to keep his group out of harm's way. He couldn't really fully protect them, but at least he wasn't trying to expose them to danger. But in early December, the authorities finally decided to move Alex's group, which by then had grown to about 300 men, from the Budapest train station to Austria. So they again boarded a train, and I'm going to ask Alex to describe some of his experiences from December of 1944 through March or so of 1945. Alex?
Well, when we boarded up, put us in the wagons and shipped us to Austria, right? Bruckenleiter, right next to Vienna. And from Vienna, we used to go out and dig ditches for tanks, so the Russian tanks couldn't come through. But it was Jews digging the ditches all the way up from Prague to down to Yugoslavia, all from different countries, Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland, and there was a whole line down there. I was there around Christmas time, and we went out there. We lived in a big barn, and we had some SS soldiers from Yugoslavia. They were worse than the Germans, so 4 o'clock in the morning, and we had to take a train out the place where we were digging them. And after about 3-4 weeks, I saw what happening, and anybody couldn't work. They shot him on the spot, they buried him out there. And one day I knew, they said, it was about 300 of us in the barn, and they said, if one going to escape, we're going to shoot 10. So I noticed more than one, but a dozen already left. They couldn't count us, right, because it was a mess. We slept in the haystack, and they can't count us. And one day I just decided, about 5 of us, he said, we're going to go back to Hungary on our own escape. And I ended up, the 4 of them, he decided, don't go, change their mind. But I did get away. And I stay out there, the place one night, and finally a train.
How did you get by? Why didn't they capture you right away?
They couldn't count it there. And I stay out there, and a German munition train was going down Yugoslavia through Hungary. I jumped on there. I had a pair of wooden shoes and froze my foot already. It was right around Christmas time in 40.
Well, what I was trying to get Alex to tell you about is how he got ready for that escape. Everybody else bailed out on it, but he went through with it. It was very cold, and so he put on all of his clothes that he had, just in layers, and he also managed to get hold of a Hungarian army cap. And when he jumped off the train, he stripped off his yellow armband and his star, and he put on the Hungarian army cap. Alex has the good fortune at that point to not look Jewish, and so, or at least that's what he thought. So he hoped that with that disguise he could get by. And did that work?
No. All of a sudden, when I jumped off a train in the first city in Hungary, I had a machine gun stick in my back, and the guy spoke Russian and a little German, but I couldn't speak either one of them. So he wanted to know. I was prepared. I got rid of his star and everything else. He wanted to know what I'm doing there. I said, I'm a Hungarian, and I just got back. He knew I was riding on the train. He let me go. I was lucky because otherwise he was going to get rid of me. And then I got nowhere to go because my house was used as a storage. I only was about 50 miles from the sail from from the border, and I couldn't go there. Somebody would recognize me. They get rid of me anyhow. So I traveled back and forth, and I hit places. I ended up a place, a group of Jewish people worked on a railroad, so I joined them. It already was the Germans was already had to. They were in Hungary and were coming back, and they lost when they left Romania. They lost first of all the biggest gasoline problem, and I joined these people, and I had to leave there. I ended up going back to the village. My parents got a friend there, and I went in their barn. I was there for 2 days, and finally I found who was in the barn, and I was there for a week. But I couldn't go in the house because the Germans and the Hungarian Nazis was all over the place. So they told me, you can't stay too long. The father came out and said, if somebody found you here, they're going to shoot us and shoot you. So I left again. I went out and I went from one place to the other. They had 4 foot of snow by that time, and I went to. I ended up with the border town again. I ended up in Austria again, and but meantime I was on the front of a Hungarian court and everything else, and I let myself out of there. I told them I'm running from the Russian, and the Hungarian colonel, he wasn't really a Nazi, and the two German, he was a translator for me. I couldn't speak German. I didn't want to speak German. And he said to me, I'm running from the Russian instead of I was coming back from Austria, because if you say that, he told me Hungarian what to say, and he translated too. He knew my father. This happened. He was a lawyer, different civilian clothes. So, and they let me go. It was only about 2 months before the war was over.
Well, let me recap a little bit. Alex obviously had some very difficult and life-threatening experiences during that period. It may have seemed a little jumbled as he was telling about it here, and I think that's in part because he was suffering from exposure and starvation, and perhaps from typhus as well. So he has a lot of clear memories, but they're not necessarily quite in the order. After his life was saved by that Hungarian colonel who told him what to tell the Germans, he was sent back to yet another work battalion and ended up once again back in Austria. And that takes us, for Alex's story, through March or so of 1945. And I'd like to leave his story for a few minutes and turn back the clock to the summer of 1944 and to my grandmother Aronka and my Aunt Piri, and also to my mother. As you heard from Alex, in June of 1944, his family in Seal was moved to the Chorna ghetto, and not long after Alex was taken away to the labor battalion, the Chorna Jews, including my grandmother and young aunt, were moved to another countryside ghetto area in the nearby city of Ugod. My story, my explanation, and Alex's don't correspond 100%. We just haven't figured out all the details, but that's what I understand from my mother. My mother also ended up at the Ugod ghetto. There, my mother, grandmother, and aunt lived in part of a house that was owned by a relative who happened to live there before the war. My mother and my grandmother sensed that worse was still to come, and one night they sneaked out of the house in Ugod and they crept into the nearby woods. There they buried gold coins, jewelry, and other valuables that they had collected, both family jewelry and mementos, and really whatever they could get from selling and liquidating the family's remaining possessions. Just a few days later, the Nazis came for my family and the other Jews in Ugod. They were taken to a true urban Jewish ghetto area in the nearby city of Papa, which was actually only about 9 miles away. All of this is in the yellow circle that you see on the map there. From the Papa ghetto, my mother and others were taken daily to outlying areas for forced labor in cornfields, and this went on for several weeks. Then, on Thursday, July 6, 1944, all the Jews in the Papa ghetto were rounded up by German and Hungarian troops. On that day, with thousands of other Hungarian Jews from the countryside, My mother and her family were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother, my grandmother, and my aunt were forced into cattle railroad cars. The train arrived in Auschwitz the next day, Friday, July 7, 1944. At Auschwitz, they were forced off the train and lined up. As the line moved forward, my grandmother and my aunt were directed to the left with the other elderly people and children, and my mother was directed to the right with the other able-bodied Hungarian Jews. I don't think my mother knew at the time what the significance of the left and right directions were, but my grandmother and aunt probably were dead before the end of the day. Standing in line by the train was the last time my mother saw my grandmother and my aunt. My grandmother and my 9-year-old Aunt Petey were far from alone in being murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. The mass train deportations to Auschwitz began on May 15, 1944, starting in the eastern part of the country. For those of you familiar with Elie Wiesel's story, Night, how many of you are familiar with that? Yeah, terrific. I've circled the village here where he and his family lived before they were sent to Auschwitz in one of the earliest deportations, as he described in Night. Within about 8 weeks, the countryside, I'll repeat that, within about 8 weeks, the countryside was emptied of its Jewish population. The Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators killed around 500,000 Hungarian Jews during just the last 12 months of the war. 1 out of 3 Jews murdered at Auschwitz was Hungarian. This is a staggering number, 500,000. What does it mean in real terms? I think it's hard to comprehend. How many of you have driven on 4 or 5 hour automobile trips? Good. For example, to St. Louis or Cleveland. So you remember what that's like. If you lined up 500,000 people sitting single file in seats like those in this room, the line would stretch for about 284 miles from Ball State's campus to downtown Cleveland, or the other direction, almost to St. Louis. So just think about that. That's 500,000 people. But we're talking about 500,000 murders. That means about 1,350 murders every day for 12 straight months. I see that there are about 50 people in the classroom here today. This would mean 27 groups of this size murdered every day for 12 straight months. Now, this might be a good time to explain the slideshow of faces that has been playing on the small computer under the screen there. You have seen one face every 60 seconds. So, and that's the average rate, 7 days a week, day and night, 24 hours a day, at which the Nazis and their collaborators murdered Hungarian Jews during the last 12 months of the war. 1 murder every minute for 12 months. In the 35 minutes or so that we've talked to you so far, you've seen about 35 people's faces. Those are all real victims of the Holocaust. Each one represents a Hungarian Jew who was murdered during that time. But this slideshow is not just an abstract representation for Alex and for me. These faces are members of our own family, brothers, sisters, parents, uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents, great-uncles, great-aunts. These were people, many of whom my mother and Alex knew very well, family that I never had a chance to know myself because they were murdered in the Holocaust. We showed you some pre-war family photos earlier. Here are many of them again. Do you recognize them? Hopefully you do. I've marked those who perished in the Holocaust. I won't leave you hanging about my mother's fate at Auschwitz and afterwards. After my mother's group was directed to the right, her head was shaved and her clothes were taken, although they let her keep her shoes. She and the rest of her group were given rough prison clothes to wear, and that began my mother's stay at Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, she lived in Barrack C3 near the kitchen building. I've marked the location of her barracks on this diagram. Early every morning, a German overseer, a woman, counted them. Most days, my mother and her barracks mates were taken out and forced to move stones and rocks by hand for a railroad line the Germans were building. The barracks were very crowded, and they were given very little food and no medical attention at all. They had no utensils for eating what little food they were given. It was a brutal life. Nearly every day, one or more of the women died from starvation, disease, beatings, or other abuse. After about 5 weeks at Auschwitz, on August 15, 1944, my mother, along with 86 other women from Block C3, were put on a train, and they were taken to the Guben slave labor camp. That's about 60 miles southeast of Berlin. This time, instead of a cattle car, the Nazis used a passenger car, but it was stuffed so full that some of the women had to lie on the overhead luggage racks. At Guben, every evening my mother worked a 12-hour shift at a munitions factory. The living conditions were still brutal, but they were better than Auschwitz. A few months later, in the winter of 1944, which was a bitterly cold and snowy winter, the Soviet army invaded Germany and was driving toward Guben on their way to Berlin. In February of 1945, the Nazis forced my mother and the other slave workers at Guben to leave on foot. Later, they were forced into cattle cars, and they began a brutal, forced march journey in the dead of winter. Many were killed or froze to death along the way. At one point, my mother told me, the starving prisoners came upon a dead horse on the side of the road. Some of them were so starving that they decided to eat the horse's meat or organs. My mother was too exhausted to participate. That turned out to be fortunate, since those who did got sick and died. Those who survived the death march, like my mother, arrived several weeks later at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp near Hanover in northern Germany. I'm sure that you've all read or heard about the diary of Anne Frank, who was a Dutch Jew, right? Anne Frank died at Bergen-Belsen around the time my mother arrived there. A few weeks later, on April 15th, 1945, British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen, and they were shocked at what they found there. Thousands were dead and dying, and thousands died at Bergen-Belsen even after the British liberation. My mother was still alive, but just barely. She remained at Bergen-Belsen at a displaced persons camp for several months, regaining her strength until she returned to Hungary in late 1945. Alex was also liberated by Russian troops in March of 1945. So, Alex, I'd like to ask you to pick up with your story in March of 1945, when your group was liberated by Russian troops, and talk about your return and my mother's return to Hungary then. And you need a microphone.
Well, by this time of year, in 1945, the Russians supposed to liberate us, but we were about 300 of us in the barn laying there, and half of them, before the Russians got there, the Germans, anybody could walk, move them back farther, Germany, or get them in the big camp, get the numbers. And that's the fourth time I couldn't go anywhere because I was 95 pounds and laying there, and the Russian left me there. They didn't help me or nothing. It's one of those things because Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill made a deal. The American and the English and the French had to stop Munich, let the Russian come in. And and Russian didn't. If I could have walked, a Russian was going to take me to Siberia, work there in the camp also. And after a couple of days, the Germans went through there. They didn't have gasoline, they didn't have bullets. Few of them, these young Nazis, the Hitler trained them to show me he got 2 bullets, but they still said they're going to win the war. But they left us, and finally we got something, food in the kitchen, and I couldn't go there, but I had a relative in the kitchen worked, and he bought me some food, and I started getting on my food. Soon as the Russian left, I was, just like I said, 95 pounds. In 2 days, I get on my feet and practically crawl, because I was in Austria, only about 30 miles from the city. I'm in the village I was born. So it took me a week, but I get back, and I went back to the family who took care of me, because my house was taken over by the Germans and the Nazis. They carried everything out of there. They used it for a storage room. And I couldn't go over there because I didn't have the strength anyhow. So these people took me in, about 5 houses from my house, and brought me back and started feeding me, and I regained pretty well. And I was the only one came back. I didn't know anybody else stay alive, or what happened to I don't even know really what happened, but afterward what happened to my mother and my sister, my grandparents.
So Alex was liberated early. That was April 10.
Yeah.
When he returned to Seal. The war was not officially over yet.
No, but I was home, and I tried to recuperate, and but a month later, finally, my brother Paul came home, and the new police chief come to us. He was a friend of my parents, and got a horse and buggy, and picked up some clothes and furniture he found. And we got some furniture back and some clothes, and eventually I was there about a year. I had a pretty good job with the electrical company, but I knew I wasn't going to stay there. And I had a couple uncles in the United States.
Let's not go quite that far yet. But in October of 1945, my mother, Alex's sister Muncie, returned, and as Alex mentioned before, his oldest brother Joe didn't return until 1946. He'd been injured by shrapnel and held as a prisoner of war in Russia until that point. Siberia, right. So 4 of the Chilog family siblings survived. And the family eventually learned from the Red Cross that Brother Louis had been killed on the Russian front when German troops used his Hungarian labor battalion to clear a minefield. And Alex's mother, Aronka, and sister Piti were, as you know, murdered at Auschwitz. Now, remember the jewelry and gold that my mother and grandmother buried in the woods outside the house in Ugod? You remember that? Good. With her brothers, my mother recovered the treasure. She was the only one who knew where it was, and they used most of it to help them start their lives in war-battered Hungary. A few of the items remained and were actually brought to Indianapolis when my mother and her uncles with their families, including me, immigrated to the United States in 1956. here's a photo of some of those items. I first came across these when I was a small child in grade school. I think it was a snow day from school, and I was looking through a drawer in my parents' dining room buffet when I ran across a cloth bag with some random items in it. When I asked my mother about that, it was the first time she told me the story about burying the treasure in the woods. Today, these items are on display at the Jewish Community Center in Indianapolis. So, getting back to the beginning of our talk, what we've told you about this afternoon is just a small part of Holocaust history. The story of some of our family members and illustrating the story of just one group of people in one country in just the last year of the Holocaust. So I hope that helps you better appreciate the Holocaust as a personal tragedy and event affecting real people and not just a historical event of numbers and statistics, and why it's important to learn about and remember it nearly 70 years later. But of course, a history lesson isn't the only reason to study the war and the Holocaust. Another, even more important reason to study and understand this history is to learn from it and to help make sure that the same mistakes by governments and by ordinary people are not repeated. To do that, I think we have to ask ourselves some questions. How could this have happened? How could governments, how could people, indeed ordinary people like us, allow such horrific, such obviously profoundly wrong things to occur? And what can we do to avoid this in the future or to stop it in the present? Now, I can't tell you that I have all the answers, and I think it's important that you think about it for yourselves. But I do have a few lessons that I think are important, and I'd like to share them with you. Lesson number one is that it's still happening. Genocides are still going on today. We, human beings, have not learned enough from our past mistakes. Genocides and mass atrocities are, in fact, occurring today, for example, in Syria, in the Middle East, in Darfur, in the western the Sudan, in Africa, and with the Rohingya people, a Muslim minority in Myanmar, formerly Burma, in Asia. I regret to say that all these are recent or current examples. Even in Europe, the unfortunate heartland of the World War II Holocaust, the lessons from the past seem to have been forgotten. There are reports of rising anti-Semitism in Europe today, many involving nationalist parties in Hungary and in elsewhere. I have personal reports of that from remaining relatives in Hungary. Lesson number two, I think, is that government-sanctioned hatred, bullying, and dehumanization were key ingredients that allowed the Holocaust to occur. The governments of Germany and its allies blamed the Jews for causing all kinds of troubles, economic and social. And they took the position that Jews were subhuman, not worthy of being treated as people. The Nazis even adopted laws to carry out and justify their inhuman treatment of the Jews. The most well-known of these laws are Germany's Nuremberg laws, starting in the early or middle 1930s. Have you heard about the Nuremberg laws? Earlier I mentioned that the Hungarian government adopted laws in the spring of 1944, but in fact Hungary began adopting racial laws similar to Germany's Nuremberg laws starting in 1938. Here's a quick summary of them. There were laws restricting occupations, prohibiting Jews from being active in certain occupations and limiting their numbers, prohibiting education, as Alex experienced himself, and restricting, or in effect, taking away the right to vote. In 1941, a law was adopted that prohibited intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. In Myanmar, the Rohingya people are prevented by law from becoming citizens. And Myanmar law even prohibits marriage between a Buddhist and a Muslim, just like the German and Hungarian racial laws prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Now, before we as Americans get too snug, this is just like the majority of American states had laws criminalizing marriage between blacks and whites until 1948. That's the majority of the states. The last of those laws was not repealed or invalidated until 1967. Indiana's law was in effect for nearly 150 years, from 1818 through 1965. Another example of dehumanization is the way the Nazis numbered the Jews in the concentration camps. My father had a tattoo on his left arm. This isn't my father's tattoo, but this man's tattoo looks very much like the one my father had. I remember when I was very young asking him about his tattoo. All he said was, "The Nazis did that." To the Nazis, he was a number, not a person. That kind of mentality even led to brutal and deadly medical and scientific experiments, or so-called medical and scientific experiments on Jews, on living people at Auschwitz. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers at Auschwitz. It began with words, with the hate speeches of Nazi leaders, and with laws that were adopted to dehumanize Jews and strip them of rights as citizens and human beings. So we should consider words like that to be an early signal of something worse to come. Lesson number 3, I think, is that personal responsibility is paramount. Closing our eyes, relying on someone else to do the right thing, is not acceptable. All of us, as individuals, have a responsibility to respect others, not merely to tolerate them. And we have a responsibility to speak out when we see wrongs or when we see bullying. Silence or indifference and inaction is not staying out of it. The practical effect of silence and inaction always favors the victimizer. It never helps the victim. The Nazis led the Holocaust, but in carrying it out, they also relied on the indifference of others and on a conspiracy of silence. I personally think that there's a special responsibility on civic leaders and on those working in professional and educated occupations, as many of you will be shortly. The Holocaust could not have been possible without the complicity, at least through silence, of people like lawyers, judges, teachers, and educators, government administrators and employees, physicians, church leaders, engineers, architects, and others who perhaps were not Nazis, but who should have been thought leaders and sounded the alarm. If you doubt that, consider that Auschwitz was a highly designed and engineered death machine. It could not have been possible without the work of engineers and architects, some of whom weren't Nazis. They just thought of themselves as professionals doing their jobs. But everyone, all of us, have a personal responsibility. If a few sympathetic farm families had not helped my Uncle Alex hide in the countryside, he might not have survived. Remember this, the Holocaust was not an accident in history. It occurred because governments and organizations and individuals made choices that legalized and validated discrimination and allowed prejudice, hatred, bullying, and ultimately mass murder to occur. So that pretty much completes our fixed presentation. There is one thing I did want to mention. I'm often asked whether I or survivors want revenge for what was done to them and to their families and friends. And I personally think that the answer is that the best revenge is that the survivors went on to rebuild their lives. They helped each other, they married, they had children, they continued their families and continued to celebrate their customs and their religion. Each of the photos that you see here includes at least one survivor with family members. Many of them are, of course, my family. So we do have time for questions, and we'd be happy to take some and have a little discussion. Thank you for your time. I can't hear very well, so I may come closer to run the mic around. Yeah. Any questions?
Was all your family able to come to the United States? Where did they settle after this experience?
Well, that's a whole other story, and I'll give you the short version. My uncle Alex actually left Hungary in 1947 and tried to come to the United States, but he wasn't quite able to make it. He was stuck in Paris for several years, and eventually, I think 1952, 51, he was able to get to the United States. We did have some relatives here in the United States who had immigrated earlier, and one of those helped him get to actually to Indianapolis, where Uncle Joe, as we called him, had a tool and die shop. In 1956, there was a revolution in Hungary against the communist government, and it was a very brief revolution.
I'm Hungarian too. My family is partly Jewish too.
Right. So the revolution was put down very quickly by Russian troops, and the Jewish community in Hungary was, a number of the members of the Jewish community felt that the Jews would be blamed for the revolution. And in fact, there were some prominent Jewish leaders of the revolution as well. And as a result of that, my parents and my mother's brothers decided that they did not want to stick around and see if they would be put in concentration camps again. And so they decided to flee Hungary. One of my uncles, who was a butcher, got hold of a truck, and he loaded it up with meat and loaded up our families and some other family friends, and they drove to the Austrian border, which was not too far away, as you saw from those maps. They used the meat as bribes for a few checkpoints that they encountered. They got to the Austrian border, abandoned the truck, and then we walked across, or I was carried across the border, and then we spent some time in displaced persons camps in Austria until Uncle Joe was able to bring all the families over.
Nixon went to Austria and left 5,000 refugees in the United States.
Yeah, the United States was very difficult about letting immigrants in, and
It took them 5 years. It took them 5 days.
and Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. I think they saw it as an opportunity to have some publicity adverse to communism, and so they opened up the immigration a little more freely in response to that. So that's a pretty quick answer, but not too quick. We have another question back here.
I wondered many times why many of the Jews that survived the Holocaust decided to come to America and not go to Israel. Like, you wouldn't have to wait until 1961. You should have gone to Israel earlier.
I was already.
Question my mind why.
Yeah.
My parents had to make it to Israel. But
So the question is why did the Jews decide to immigrate to the United States instead of Israel? I think Alex has something to say about that.
My uncle, I was in Paris and I worked electrician for 5 years, and I was there for 5 days. I had a job, and the French let anybody there who wants to work. And I was already in 1948 signed up. I was going to go to Israel, and then my uncle. I wrote to my uncle in America. He says, I can't get you out of there from Israel. You stay in Paris. And he sent me a boat ticket. Eventually, in 1951, President Truman signed my papers and let me in here. And I'm very proud of it, too. I had 8 grandchildren, and I was married a year later. I got 2 great-grandchildren, and somebody must look out for me. Thank you.
So I'm not sure we can fully answer that question for you, and I certainly wasn't there to make that decision. So, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Well, You know, I think part of it in the case of my family was not tremendously religious. Uncle Alex may disagree with that, I'm not sure. And in fact, my grandfather, whom I didn't actually know but have heard stories about, was a Hungarian nationalist. He believed that he was Hungarian first and happened to be a Jew second. And so he was a Hungarian patriot. Not that that would have done him any good.
Servant in the Austro-Hungarian army for 4 years, and he died in 39 before he turned.
So I think the draw for my family was to have the freedom to live life, not so much to immigrate to Israel. Other questions? Let me come back there and we'll have you ask it directly into the microphone so you can experience what I've had to do too.
Why did Alex change his last name?
I didn't change.
He didn't change his name, is what he's going to explain to us.
When I became citizen in 1956,
You're going to have to say that again.
my name was Cillag, and nobody could pronounce it. My children went to, I had two sons and a daughter, went to school. They call them Kiklog and Kuklog and everything else. They couldn't pronounce the CS. Instead of it be a CH, it would be different. But when I became citizen, automatically I translate my name and to the Alexander already in Paris. I changed it myself. So the French gave me a passport because I didn't have any passport before I get to Paris. I worked in the salt mine first. That's Lorengia. I mean, just like a slave labor. But after a year, he let me go, and I went to Paris. My uncle said, get to Paris and register American Consul. And American Consul asked me 20 questions every month. When I went to grade school and check on me, and finally, after 5 years, I got my visa. Thanks, God.
So he didn't change his name. He just translated
I
it.
translated. My two brothers, they claim my father was Chillag. Why don't say Chillag? But my wife was in real estate, and Star Real Estate is sounded better instead of.
So it's all about the marketing. Any other questions? Well, thank you.